How many long nights have there been? It seems like it might be a straightforward answer, but when you look at the history, it's really not. And I'm not even talking about the one in Season 8 or the one that's upcoming in the books. I'm talking just in the deep past. How many times has there been something that could be considered a long night? Now, the most obvious answer is one. There was one long night in history, and then there is one that is upcoming in the future books. But when you take a closer look at things, it starts to get a little bit complicated. Because old Nan, when she tells Bran the story, mentions that this was when the White Walkers came for the first time. Now, the obvious implication of that is that they've come more than one time. You wouldn't really say that they came for the first time if they had only come once. You would say this was when the White Walkers came. There's also just the fact that all of the ancient history of Westeros seems to be really murky and just completely mixed up in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of things that somewhat contradict each other, and there's a lot of things that just kinda don't make sense. This is definitely done intentionally by George, kind of hiding these ancient events in the fog of history, and he even calls attention to it in the books, in situations like where Sam notices that the count of Lord Commanders seems to be way off. There's also the idea that the Starks have ruled for 8,000 years, but many people in the fandom also question that. And when we saw the idea of the Long Night or the Blood Moon prequel that was being talked about by HBO, that was set 5,000 years before the main story. Now, that prequel had some pretty questionable things going on, and I don't know how much of it you can actually take as very solid George R.R. Martin-inspired lore, but one of the things that was talked about in that prequel is that the Andals were arriving right at the same time as this event was going on. Yet old Nan, when she was telling Bran the story of the Long Night, specifically says that this was before the Andals arrived in Westeros. There's also the fact that the war between the Children and the First Men is said to have taken place over 10,000 years ago and ended with the Pact on the Isle of Faces, which led to 4,000 years of friendship between the First Men and the Children. But at the same time, we get lines like Asha Greyjoy suggesting that in that war, the Children turned the trees into warriors to fight humanity. And many people speculate, and I have speculated in the past in different videos on the channel, that this is a hint that the Children created the others as a weapon against the humans. Now, in the television show, we are explicitly shown that this is the case, and in the HBO Histories and Lore, they also basically directly say that this is what happened. Conveniently for the discussion that we're having, they also mention that there were multiple instances of having to fight against the White Walkers. So I'm going to play for you some clips taken from the HBO Histories and Lore called The Children versus the First Men. If you want to see the entire video, they're up on YouTube. I would definitely recommend you check them out after this.
12,000 years ago, the First Men came from the eastern continent, crossing a land bridge called the Arm of Dawn. They cut down the Children's forests and weirwoods. A terrible war raged between the Children and the First Men that lasted for centuries.
As the war raged, the Children resorted to the one advantage they had, the magic of their old gods. Their green seers enlisted dire wolves and snow bears. In return, the First Men cut down and burned every weirwood they could find. The Children became desperate. Their green seers called down the Hammer of Waters to break the Arm of Dawn and to flood the neck to contain men to the south. But the First Men would not be stopped. Fearing extinction, the Children combined their powers for one last spell. By themselves, the Children were too few to resist the onslaught. But if they could turn men's numbers against them, after hundreds of years and untold death and destruction, the wisest heads of the Children and the First Men finally prevailed. Heroes and rulers on both sides met upon an isle in the God's Eye to form the Pact. Thus ended the Dawn Age and began the Age of Heroes. Yet after the dawn must come the night. The great evil that the Children unleashed in the war returned centuries later, and only an alliance between the Children and men defeated it.
So you heard it in the voice of Bloodraven himself in the HBO Histories and Lore, and while that isn't as solid as actually being written out in the books, I think it does actually directly line up with what we're told in the books, between the line of the Children turning the trees into warriors when they fought with the First Men, and the whole idea of the pact and the long night where the children had to help fight against the others, all of this does seem to line up exactly with what was presented there. In other words, there were at least multiple instances of having to fight off the White Walkers. Now, you could have even more instances of having to fight them off when you take into account the story of the Night's King, who supposedly the night was his to rule. That sounds like some potential long night imagery, and obviously he glimpsed his woman, who seems very much like a White Walker, from atop the wall. If the wall was created already, that means that they've already fought the White Walkers before, and whatever happened with the Night's King was a completely separate incident. Then if Blood Moon is at all to be believed, there was another incident when the Andals first arrived, which would kind of make sense because they were the ones who were the most successful at chopping down and destroying weirwoods, and if the others were created to essentially protect the weirwoods in the first place, well then that would just kind of all line up that they would show up again when the Andals arrived. So there might have been even up to 4 or more instances of having to fight the others. So just in Westeros, we have 12,000 years ago the war between the children and the first men, 8,000 years ago supposedly the wall is created and the long night happened, and then 13 Lord Commanders later you have the Night's King, and then apparently 5,000 years ago you have whatever was going on in Blood Moon. So the timeline is very messy, and a lot of it is, as we said, just up in the air where you can sort of piece it together in the way that feels like it makes the most sense to you. But it's not just in Westeros that we have stories of the Long Night. The Rhoynar have their legend of a darkness that was so terrible that it caused the Rhoyne itself to dwindle and disappear, and waters were all frozen even far in the south. This was only ended when essentially a hero was able to get the different bickering sides of a war to come together and sing a song, and that song returned the daylight. In Yi Ti, the legend of the Long Night begins with the blood betrayal, and it is said that the Lion of Night was unleashed upon the world because the Maiden of Light turned her back on it. It's claimed that this darkness was only averted in the end when a woman with a monkey's tail was able to somehow end it. The 5 forts were supposedly built to essentially defend against a future Long Night type situation over in the Far East. This is also where the legend of Azor Ahai comes from, and there are basically many different legends from all these different cultures that all tell basically the same exact story of a hero doing a similar thing just with a different name. There are basically 2 ways to take this. The first is that the Long Night was a global Long Night that affected the entire planet, but the problem with that is the fact that all of these different cultures have all of these stories about how it was ended by someone in their area. The other way that you could take this is that long nights are essentially a localized problem caused by a specific magical circumstance that usually takes place in some sort of war or some sort of terrible betrayal like the blood betrayal, right? If you have some sort of situation where maybe the corrupting of the world tree causes a long night because you're using these trees for terrible blood magic, or you have situations where these terrible magical wars are causing the long night and then there's a magical solution to it, this could be sort of a localized problem that keeps happening in cycles because that's human nature, and essentially war is a cycle that constantly continues to happen. I could really kind of see this fitting in with a lot of George R.R. Martin's themes, where essentially history definitely rhymes or repeats itself in different ways in different cultures all throughout the timeline. And to me, it would also seem a little bit weird if every other culture has a different story about how a hero in their area ended the long night if it was truly a global phenomenon. If that is the case, basically what seems to be happening then is that the last hero, or Azor Ahai, or the song that was sung to bring back the day, or the woman with the monkey's tail, maybe they didn't actually end the long night? If the reading is essentially that the long night was a global phenomenon that only happened once and is just remembered in different legends, all for different reasons, then basically it would seem that none of the local heroes who were supposedly the ones who ended it actually had anything to do with it at all. This could sort of mirror like essentially you have an ancient ritual to essentially bring the sun back when an eclipse happens, and then if you do your ritual everyone thinks that it worked because the sun eventually returns, but really you had nothing to do with it. The implications of the idea that none of the actions of these heroes, supposedly credited with ending the long night, actually had anything to do with it would be pretty wild and would have a big effect on the future of our story. To me, it would seem somewhat more George R.R. Martin if the effects of the long night were in fact caused by localized problems, things like the blood betrayal or these wars or these terrible magical things that are going on, and then they were solved by the actions of our characters, because that gives some agency to the people in the story. But I could actually sort of see this one going either way. This is a bit like the video I did a while ago talking about how long the long night could last. I am genuinely up in the air on the idea and really curious to hear what you all think of it and what arguments you can make down in the comments. Do you think there was only one long night? Do you think there's been multiple? Do you think it was a global phenomenon? Do you think it's on some level localized with all these different heroes playing different roles in solving different magical problems that caused a similar magical effect? I do think if you wanted me to give an answer as to which way I lean more, I'd say it's more likely that the long night has happened multiple times and it's sort of a localized phenomenon. There being multiple long nights and different areas of the world having different long nights with different causes just seems to make a lot more sense of some of the mysteries in the ancient past and some of the stories that we hear from around the world. Another thing that's kind of interesting that I hadn't really considered until I saw it in a recent Interesting Nerd Club video is that A Shy by the Shadow, or just the Shadow as it's sometimes called, is all very dark. And honestly, it does seem sort of like if an area was under a localized long night that they had done something magical to not solve the problem, but instead just live with the issue. If the long night hit a more summery climate, and you didn't have all of the sweeping cold, you just had the darkness, that would sort of seem a lot like what A Shy by the Shadow is described as being. Now we know there's definitely some sort of magical weirdness going on in A Shy by the Shadow, but is a localized long night actually to blame for it? I really don't know, but I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts on that as well. Let me know what you think of all of that, and let me know if there's anything else that I missed that might help solve this mystery. Thank you all for watching, remember to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you with something else very soon.